Hello, I guess we can start now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's speaker series. We are going to talk today about the changing landscape of equity, diversity, and inclusion in the era of reconciliation and anti-racism. I would like to start by acknowledging that we're in Saskatchewan, and Saskatchewan is on treaty territory, specifically Treaty 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10, the traditional land of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Dene, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. We recognize and honor the rich history and contributions of Indigenous people to this land and commit to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect. We encourage everyone to be allies for the Indigenous people and reflect on the lands where you are situated. Seek to learn of strength, resilience, and achievements of Indigenous people. My name is Vanessa Rodriguez, and lead delivery with BHP, and I also volunteer with the Women in Mining and Women in Saskatchewan. I will be moderating or hosting the session today. So I will start with a few housekeeping items. We ask everyone to please keep their settings on mute. Feel free to post questions in the chat. We will be monitoring those, and we will be using the backend of the session to go through them with our speaker today. And I want to remind everybody that we will be recording this session for future reference. Regarding the topic, we're going to talk about the landscape of equity, diversity, and inclusion and how it is evolving as organizations are increasingly committing to reconciliation and anti-racism targets. So we're moving beyond just representation to addressing those barriers, systemic barriers, power imbalances, and historical injustices. This requires then to center on Indigenous rights, amplify marginalized, sorry for my pronunciation, marginalized voices, and integrating cultural humility into policies and practices in the organizations. So organizations are now challenged to move from performative gestures to actual transformative actions, creating environments where equity is embedded, diversity is valued, and inclusion becomes a shared cultural foundation. And to talk about that, we have Liz. Elizabeth Duret is a certified life skill coach, experienced group facilitator, and also she holds a professional designation of Chartered Professional in Human Resources, or CPHR. Since joining the University of Saskatchewan Human Resources Division in April 2015 as the Inclusion and Diversity Consultant, Liz had led strategic initiatives with a strong emphasis on Indigenous engagement. With over 2 decades of experience in human resources and consulting, Liz brings deep expertise, extensive training, and a genuine passion to her work. Her focus areas include equity, diversity and inclusion, emotional intelligence, Indigenous engagement, and more recently, anti-racism and anti-oppression education, particularly in response to the Black and Indigenous Lives Matter movement. Liz is a sought-after speaker and facilitator, having delivered workshops and presentations at local, provincial, and national levels. In September 2019, she was selected as one of the 18 speakers for the TEDx University of Saskatchewan, where she delivered a compelling talk about diversity is an inside job. The presentation encapsulates her dedication to fostering meaningful change and the personal motivations that drive her work. In 2025, Liz was awarded the President's Staff Excellent Award at the University of Saskatchewan for her equity, diversity, and inclusion and anti-racism, anti-oppressive work. On a personal note, Liz is a proud Métis woman, born and raised in Saskatoon. She's the mother of 2 adult sons and shares her home with a beloved rescue dog named Oliver. Deeply connected to her community, Liz is committed to making a positive and lasting impact in Saskatoon and beyond. So I think all of that, we can welcome Elizabeth to this conversation. So thank you, Elizabeth, for being here.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa, for the introduction. I thought since you mentioned Oliver and he was right beside me, I thought I would bring him into the screen, bring a little pause therapy. I'm going to invite people in the room to put on their cameras because I like to see people, not just names. And I hope this is going to be more of a conversation versus me talking for 45 minutes. And Vanessa mentioned that she'll be kind of manning the questions and stuff. But please, if you could turn on your screen so I could see people. I've only see 5 people on the screen right now. I see Adrian has turned on hers, but I can't really see a whole lot of other people yet. So I'm just going to invite people to put on their screens and then, but also think about questions that you might have that you've never had maybe an opportunity to ask. Because I hope that this is going to be a safe room. It's a learning and reflection space. And, discomfort is normal. That is normal. Nobody dies from discomfort, right? Defensiveness is optional. So I'm just kind of, sort of setting the tone. And I believe that people will come here with a good heart and ask questions that are going to help inform and maybe challenge themselves to think differently and be differently. And so we're thinking about progress requires intentional action, not perfection. And I know quite often people are scared to ask questions because they don't want to say, well, is this a stupid question? Or, but then their answers go unquestioned. And when I think about this work that I've been involved in, there's no such thing, but there's harmful questions I think that people do intentionally. So, but just to, thank you for the introduction, Vanessa. And as mentioned, my name is Liz Duret. I'm born and raised in Saskatoon. I've been here my whole life. And so as an Indigenous woman growing up in Saskatoon, I have a skin in the game, so to speak. It's very personal to me about the experiences of racism and residential schools and unconscious bias and just all those areas that people are talking about, but they also start getting a little mixed up for people, right? And when we think about even equity, diversity, inclusion, some of that's even kind of getting mixed up because then we're talking about reconciliation and which is different from EDI, and then we're talking about anti-racism, and then there's intercultural competency. So there's a whole lot going on, and people say, well, what can we do? And I think even taking an hour out of your time is really important just to sort of say, to learn a little bit more because there's multiple people you can learn from. I'm one of a few people that sort of maybe have the background that I do. So I'm really, I call myself privileged to be able to do the work I do at the university, but also within the community and within our landscape in Saskatchewan. I try to stay home more. I used to travel a lot more doing conferences and stuff like that. So yeah, born and raised, I've been at the university for 11 years and I was at Sask Polytech for 10 years. And then I was with the Department of Corrections and Public Safety for 10 years. And I've seen a lot of injustices. There wasn't equity, there wasn't diversity, and there certainly wasn't inclusion. And so, the topic is how are we evolving? And I think when we first started talking about equity, diversity, inclusion, that it really was about hiring targets and demographics and committees and advisory groups. It was about visibility, but really we were hiring brown faces into white spaces. And we were seeing a high turnover of people because people were present, but they weren't being heard. And maybe there was a high level of burnout because then there was an expectation that, well, we hired somebody Indigenous, so they're going to cover everything and they're going to be all things for Indigenous people and speak for all groups, which is really not, what inclusion is about or when we're hiring Indigenous people. And so you see a high turnover of marginalized groups because they don't fit or they're not being recognized for maybe their skills and abilities. And so, people were asked to be on committees, but then their ideas weren't being heard or they weren't being respected, I guess, for their expertise that they brought that was maybe different from from a westernized or colonized perspective. And so I think it's, representation opens the door. If I were to say, like, Representation opens the door, but systems determines who stays and who thrives and who leads in those spaces. And so there's kind of like that, those little key takeaways that I want you to think about is that, it's good to get people in the door, but then you really have to think about how are you treating people once you get them in the door and what are the systems that are operating. And so, for example, when we think about EDI and we think about equity, and so my title at the University of Saskatchewan is Inclusion, Diversity, and Anti-Racism. And I always think about, I don't like my title because inclusion is like, who are we including then and who are we excluding? I think we have to ask ourselves those questions sometimes because we don't know. We see this turnover of certain groups and people, and it's a pattern, so we can't ignore the patterns. We've lost a lot of Indigenous scholars at the University of Saskatchewan because they weren't recognized for what they brought. And so we see that. And then in light of the Kamloops and the Truth and Reconciliation, people are scrambling to get Indigenous scholars and Indigenous people in the workplace, but they haven't changed the workplace. Right. And they haven't changed the systems and who's recognized and whose scholarship matters. But then you think about the workplace. Why would somebody want to come um, if they don't feel welcome? Oh my God, Vanessa, that's such a great question. So who needs to change the workplace? I'll carry on a little bit about that because when we think about we have to change policies. I think policy change is a big one. Like when we think about inclusion and we think about policies and even just our hiring practices is just simple questions. I made some notes for myself. I didn't want to leave anything out, but I think, when we think about policies, is who wrote the document, whose voices have been contributed to the document. For example, our hiring practices, who's constructing them, like in what lens, because we hear best practice all the time. And I'm sure many of you, I see Tanya and Ray and Adriana and Carla on my screen so far. But I don't see Leah or Aaron or Anne or Laura or Vanessa. So I just, when we think about who wrote the document, who's responsible for the approval, um, who's the intended audience for, when we're doing all this work. I always tell people at the university is who's not in the room, who benefits from this document or from these processes. Because if we keep seeing the same things happening over and over, then we're not getting it right. And so we think about, does the document demonstrate impartiality? Right? Is there stereotypes? Is there anything that would perpetuate biases or stereotypes or anything in any of our policies, any of the work that we're doing? And does this document discriminate against certain people? So again, if you're thinking about interview questions, you're thinking about recruitment, you're thinking about all those things, do you have the right people? Even work hours, I'm going to give you an example. When I was at Sask Polytech, and I'm trying to think, I can't remember exactly what happened that day, but we had 3 males in our leadership, and there was something to do with home care or like with childcare. There was something that happened that day, and I can't go back in my memory far enough to remember exactly what happened, but women were being disproportionately affected that day with daycare, with kids, with whatever was going on. And the 3 males at the top were saying, well, no, they'll have to take vacation leave, they'll have to do this. But if it was a male who was experiencing it, they would have just been given the day. So one of my female leaders went up there and said, you guys aren't even parents. Like, you're not even understanding, like, this is affecting women disproportionately. And so she went in and kind of gave them a bit of a talking to. And, and they're like, oh, yeah, okay, we never looked at it that way. So something as simple as when you go in rooms, do we have gender? Do we have ethnic diversity? And so the other thing with my title is when we talk about EDI and people say we want to hire for diversity. And I want you to think about that language and this very kind of critically is like when we say EDI, we talk about equity, which I think is great. And then we talk about diversity, but who's diverse? Because if we all sat in this room, we're all diverse. So somehow, this is where I'm going to start slipping into the anti-racism discussion. Because when we say well, we want to hire for diversity. We're kind of othering. It's not kind of, we are othering people. And so somehow whiteness is considered the norm to which all things are measured against. And this is where it gets uncomfortable too, by the way. So for anybody, but whiteness is a construct, by the way, right? It was a made up thing because I do this work. And so, racism is a construct. We do a whole bunch of scholarship. We do a whole bunch of work around this. And when people start understanding that it's a construct and who made it up, and when you even look at our country's first government, it was all white men. There was no representation of Black or Indigenous or anything constructing our country. So think about the implications even in government and everything else. And so when we think about diversity, we have to really be very specific about what it is we're talking about. Like, for example, if you talk about nursing or you talk about certain fields where um, women are really represented quite well, but men aren't. But then we start slicing and dicing that. Are people familiar with equity groups, the four equity groups? Okay, so Vanessa's not, but I've seen Tanya nodding. So Tanya, can you unmute yourself and tell me who the four equity groups are? Or is she typing it? Oh, maybe she's typing it. Oh, okay. Okay, thank you for that. All right. Um, so the four equity groups, and I want you just to think about this. So from when we think about the evolution of EDI, Judge Rosalie Abella years ago did a study on who was not represented in the workplace, and who they came up with was women, visible minorities, racialized groups, persons with disabilities, and Indigenous people. Okay, so those were your four equity groups. Now, those are also being revised right now to include Two-Spirit LGBTQIA. So they're also going to be included, and but it hasn't evolved yet. I know they did a reading on it already, so I try to keep up on that to see who's involved. But anyhow, the four equity groups are those groups. And who do you think has made the most gains out of those four equity groups? Women. But I want to be really clear about something. It's white women, not women of color, and not Black women, not Indigenous women. And so, and even still, women make below men across Canada, like across Canada boards, academia sometimes, but they're trying to close those gaps. But it's interesting. So when you think about equity, diversity, inclusion, I did not choose as an Indigenous person to be considered an equity group member, right? And so I'm going to pivot a little bit on you here and start talking about, but I want you to think about those are the four groups that are historically not represented in the workplace. Women have made the greatest gains, but they're still not making equivalent pay equity compared to men across Canada. So we're still behind. But again, white women, not Indigenous or Black, and that goes down exponentially. So we have a lot of outcomes. And then when we start talking about truth and reconciliation, and I think where it became, and yes, and yeah, and immigrant women, absolutely, thank you. When we think about how the landscape changed, Indigenous people have been talking about truth and reconciliation for a very long time. And we have, the calls to action, and people were just sort of complacent. And it was really frustrating because then when the Kamloops graves were found, and are people familiar with that? Can I just see so I see some people nodding. Yeah. Vanessa, are you familiar with that at all? No. Oh my gosh. Okay. And Ariana, are you
I, I'm I may be familiar and maybe another term in my country though.
okay.
I've been in Canada for 3 years. Mm.
Okay, that's why. Okay. Yeah. So this happened a while back. Are you familiar with residential schools at all? Okay. So as a result of that, what they found is a number of graves, unmarked graves at a number of residential schools across Canada. Okay. And so then all of a sudden, people woke up, it seemed, that they woke up and went, oh my God, like we need to do something. And we're like, we've been saying this for years, right? And and all of a sudden people started really taking to, like, I don't know, I guess that's what it took. And then for me, I'll be quite honest with you, I was frustrated and I was angry because then, people were just wearing shirts and doing all these things, but it was like performative to me. It's like, well, what are you going to do in your workplace? Or what are you going to do about our homelessness? What are you going to do to do all that stuff? And so we really have to think about what that means for our workplaces and for EDI, because I think when we think about women, when we think about immigrant women, Black, Indigenous women, when we think about inclusion, it's really about culture change in the workplace saying, and I think the one thing that I think is hard for people is saying, well, we don't know what to do or how to do it. And I always think about when you walk into a room, do you see yourself represented? Do you feel comfortable? Do you feel like there's other people in your space that represent you or look like you, or even have things around? Like, you don't want just things because that's, again, performative, but you want your voice heard. You want to be taken seriously. You want to be invited. You want to be talked, like part of the system change or challenge them and not be punished for it. Because there's a lot of times, and I'm very privileged at the university. I've been there long enough that I think that I can reach out to our president and say, you know what, this isn't right, and we need to change this, and here's how we can do it. I never just complain without having a solution attached to it. That I think it's about, repairing relationships and authentic relationships. Because if you look at your family photos, let's say family photos, weddings, gatherings, your friendships, how much diversity is in those groups of people from different groups. And if you think in the workplace, quite often people will go in their own little groups because they don't feel like, well, one, it's comfortable and they can speak their native language. Sometimes English is a second language for people. But how often do we engage people then? Whether accents are harder. Vanessa, you said, oh, pardon me, I couldn't say something. It's like, well, how do we engage people? Because it's about patience, because we've operated in this westernized, colonized way for so long that we don't always give space to people who don't fall in line or who don't look like the rest of the community members. And so, because for a lot of people, they have to code shift when they come into the workplace, they have to dress a certain way. Their perspectives are kind of add-ons. They're not part of, we talk about baking a cake at work sometimes, and it having Indigenous voices as part of it. It's like, don't come to me with a cake and saying, okay, now we want your input. The cake is already baked. We want to be part of the ingredients that make up the whole of the cake. And so if you think about your workplaces, are you getting the right people in the room? Are you including people? Are you hiring people? And if you're not hiring the right people, what are the qualifications that you're asking for? Because quite often people overstretch. And if you're hiring for certain roles and they're asking for like a master's or a whatever, like certain things, is that really necessary? Because there's a lot of raw talent out there that we're not tapping into because we've outstretched. Like, I know there was a job years ago when I was speaking, well, there's lots of jobs actually, and they required like a bachelor. But then people were competing with masters and they were screening out the people with the bachelors. And I said, but why are we doing that? That's like a discriminatory practice. And they said, well, and so in their mind, bias was that if they have a master's, they're better. And, so I was like, well, no, that's not right. If, we're comparing people and we're looking for people who are representative of the community that we're serving, we're not just looking for all the same. And when we talk to, okay, Lori, thank you for joining us. When we think about who we're hiring, are we being inclusive in our practices? So I have talked for like 20 some minutes now, and I'm really curious if there's other questions. I would love to hear if there's questions, though I could keep talking, but I'd rather hear from you guys a little bit. If you have a question you've always wanted to ask, but you're just not quite sure.
Carla has her hand up.
Sure. Carla.
Hi. I guess I have a couple of questions. If companies don't already have that representation and are going through the process of trying to build the frameworks to get that, how can they go about getting that sort of input from those groups if they don't have them? And is there a way to approach that for companies who are just starting out in the space?
Yeah, that's probably the best question, I think, is how do you build relationships? Because it really is about relationships. And I think for a lot of people, it's very hard because they don't want to take the time. And when you're thinking about building relationships with your own friendships, it takes time, right? Like you don't just go in and sit down and start doing business. It really is about building relationships and finding out people and going to events, like say the powwows. There's lots of events that go on for Indigenous people and finding out who those leaders are, going and introducing yourself and saying, we're working on these things, looking for Indigenous consultants. And people like that to come and sit at your table. So quite often I'm asked to come and like just put on retainer and people saying, is this land acknowledgement right? Or are we doing this right? Or, going in and just talking about maybe unconscious bias and why they keep doing the same thing and not moving forward. So there's a number of things they can do is hire consultants, go to events, introduce themselves to leaders and invite these leaders in, but don't expect free labor, right? Like it's a reciprocity. Like if you think about relationships and reciprocity, that's some of your best way forward because it's not just about taking, it's about how do you like when we think about reconciliation, it's about shoulder to shoulder and seeing each other as equally valid and that and respected and true. Right. So I think that's part of it is really you just have to put the effort in to build relationships with Indigenous communities, people, because there's lots of Indigenous people out there who do businesses of all sorts of things and have a valuable perspective. Like I have a list of people that I would, when I'm not available or they want something from me, I will say, oh, actually, I think this is probably a better person for you, and just and do referrals. So then once you start opening up those pathways to relationships, you're going to find you're going to have tools to go to many relationships because it's a smaller circle of Indigenous people and we all talk about, oh, I worked for so and so and I worked for so and so. Oh, well, you should go over here or we should partner or do whatever, right? But because I work pretty much full time at the university, I don't have a lot of time for consulting anymore. But I mean, that's what we would do. We would partner up and somebody'd say, oh, you should go meet Liz or whatever. So I think
Yeah.
that's a really good start, Carla.
Yeah. My other side of this question is if you happen to be the person who was hired as an effort to get more inclusion, and then you're in the position of being expected to be the advocate for your whole group, how do you it becomes very daunting, to be the token person. And as you said about code shifting and stuff like that, I find myself doing it lots with, with this group of people, I have to act this way to get the things that I need out of my job or my situation at work. And it's it becomes difficult. How do you, I guess, what would be advice for people in that situation to handle these pressures? You can't be expected to be the one and end all advocate, but it's
Absolutely
hard.
not.
Yeah.
Like if whether it's an accountant, whether it's a mining, whether it's like all the things that they do, it's either built into their job and they're rewarded for it, or you don't ask them. Like they just want to come to work, right? Because I think that's really unfair that you're putting extra labor on other people, on racialized people to
Yeah.
gain, right? So I think
Yeah. It's, I guess maybe an advice question is, how do you get people to, what would be the response that you would give somebody in that situation? Say, if someone had asked you to be that person and as you said, it's not their job, what would you advise that person to say? Hey, no, I'm not interested. It's
just
hard. I
say, you know
don't,
what, I have enough on my plate. Like
yeah,
I wasn't hired to do this work
yeah.
unless you're willing to rewrite my job to include
In
it
most
and
cases,
compensate me for it. Like honestly,
yeah,
but a lot of people don't have that
yeah,
because we're just happy to be working and included sometimes, but that doesn't mean that we should be taken advantage of.
yeah,
And and I would just say like I have enough on my plate, and this is like I came here to work and do this work. And thank you for asking me. I appreciate it, and hire more so that we can all share the load.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, great.
I remember a project that I was in, and a person that was working in the project was an Indigenous people, right? And they were asking all sorts of questions about what names to use on places, what would look, what how can the design include things like visuals that also communicates something or to the Indigenous people. And I understand why they did it, but this person was exhausted at the end of the project. It was like, I'm here to do a technical job, not this. This is not my role. So I can see how that could be. I mean, I saw that case in that project, right? Not great.
Yeah, and I think it's really important if you're going to hire racialized people in, and if you want them to do that work, they should be compensated for it, right? Like if they're hired to do like IT or whatever it is that they're doing, then that's what they're doing. But I think to ask, like I've been asked to come in, and when I said I was charging, they're like, "Oh no, we don't pay," but yet they'll pay a speaker to come in and spend thousands on it, but not pay me to come in and speak, right? That's extortion. That's yeah, that's just not right. That you're going to pay somebody else, but you're paying an Indigenous person to come in and give you information. Vanessa, I see that Ray has a question.
Hi, yeah, hi. So my name's Ray Leach. I work with Cameco. I am the Indigenous Engagement Specialist for Northern Saskatchewan, and I am a proud member of Sapatuayak Cree Nation in Manitoba. So hi, everyone. I'm really new to Cameco, but I'm not new to the EDI platform. I actually, in another life, I worked with Coast Guard, and I was actually one of the founding members for their EDI committee there. So it's something pretty near and dear to my heart. I grew born and raised in Winnipeg, but a Cree woman. Yeah, like I was raised in an adopted family, Caucasian family, away from my birth family, which is actually a really common story. And yeah, so I've actually like reestablished my relationship with my biological family, and that's been going strong for a couple decades now. But I mean, it's just EDI, the environment of EDI, I mean, it's still so uncharted. I mean, all these things that Liz has been talking about in this conversation, I mean, it's really still so jarring to come up against like unconscious biases, or systemic racism that people don't even know that they are supporting. I mean, and it can be really frustrating. I mean, and it's just, I don't know. Like I always find that like when those things happen, like it's a good way just to say like no, like my worldview is different, like my perspective is different. I mean, I know for like my Cree family, a lot of people like there's just a different approach to life that isn't the same as like mainstream Canadian life, I mean, and it's not better, it's not worse, it's just different. And I think like that jarring aspect of it too, like people don't really get like the culture shock that people experience when they come to like urban settings like Saskatoon or Winnipeg. People don't really realize like people are coming from these tiny little places where everybody knows everyone, and a lot of times it's like, yeah, people speak English, but it's not really like it's like the Indigenous language that's prevalent, So yeah, it's I don't know, like it's funny because it always like when presented like with that feeling of like difference, that othering that Liz was talking about. I mean, when I was in university, I always came across that. It was like I would walk into a classroom, and I would be surrounded by 30 other students, but they were all white. I was the only person of color, and it makes you feel really uncertain. It makes you feel really not scared, but just sort of like, whoa, like I feel really like just by myself here, you know? And yeah, so I mean, so I really think that EDI platforms and these types of conversations, like we have to keep them going. You know, I mean, it's the only way to like normalize the difference in the cultural shift right now. So yeah, I think I really like this conversation. So thanks for having it. I'm enjoying it.
Yes, you're so welcome. And it's interesting. So I will give you my personal feelings on EDI. I think the equity part really is where it lands for me, is the equity, which is really interesting because my title is inclusion diversity. So we're all diverse, and that doesn't serve anything. It's more like who's not in the room, whose voices aren't being heard, whose voices are we centering, who are we valuing? And then when I think about inclusion, well, who are we? Like, it's like somebody saying we want to include Indigenous people, but we're on Treaty 6 territory or Treaty 4 territory. That's like saying, here, welcome into my house, but get out. We're going to kick you out and then welcome you back in. Like, so inclusion of Indigenous people, that's where I really struggle, because the language, when we say we want to include Indigenous people, we're on Treaty 6 territory. And we're on, homeland of the Métis. And when I think about that, so that doesn't really sit with me, right? So that's why when I think about indigenization and I think about truth and reconciliation and anti-racism, that's kind of where my heart is, because also EDI was kind of more invented by white people, and it's white centering, because Indigenous people did not ask to be part of an equity group. We're sovereign nations and have rights and have all those things, but we're not recognized that way. And as Ray spoke about, it's always being othered, and so it's like going into your own home and not feeling welcome. So how do we start changing that, right? And so when I think about anti-racism, and that's what's really hard, like this work has been really disruptive for me, but I also realized how colonized I was and how I went along to get along, and I didn't, say what needed to be said sometimes. And so once I drank the tea, the anti-racism tea, and I've done lots of it, and now I love it. And like, it's hard work, it's emotional labor, it's also very challenging, but I tell you what, I love it, and it's challenged our leaders at the university to think differently. But when we're all speaking the same language, we can start challenging each other a lot more about systems. And it really is, EDI in some ways is about compliance and numbers and representation, where when we think about anti-racism, it's about active disruption of unequal systems. It's about willingness to name power and privilege, and recognizing, like I always say when we're at the university, I said, I have a lot of privilege in certain areas, but I don't necessarily have power, but I have privilege, right? And so we all have power and privilege, but how do we use it? And a lot of people who are white going, well, I don't have any power and privilege. I grew up poor and I worked hard and I did all these things. And I'm like, but you never had to deal with race, right? And so when I think about that, like, because the one thing about having power and privilege, you're not immune to illness, death, hardship, poverty, any of those things. None of us are immune to that. It just means you don't have to deal with race. Or if you have to learn about racism, that's privilege because you're learning about it. You don't have to experience it. And so I think people really struggle with this because they're saying, well, I don't see racism, because you don't have to. And that's where the beauty of relationships come involved. And I think about one of my dearest friends. We've been friends for 20 years. And as recently as probably 4 years ago, 5 years ago, she moved up into the Flin Flon area and said, oh, you should come up here. Like, it's going to be great. We're going to do this and that. And she said, my other friend was up last week. We had a great time. And I said, yeah, but Jacqueline's white. I'm not. Right. And I said, I'm brown. We're up in that country. I said, they're not going to treat me the same. She's like, no, of course they are, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, come on, take your blinders off. We've been friends for how long? And she goes, yeah, but I love you. Like, and I said, yeah, but you and I are different. Like, come on. So I went up to Flin Flon and we did I said, we're going to do an experiment. I said, I'll be me, you be you. And we're just going to walk around and you just notice. I need you to notice how people treat me, how they make eye contact with me or not, or how they watch me, or how they don't serve me or not. I said, I will just be me and we're going to carry on. She's like, all right. So off we went for a few hours and we came home. And she has these big, beautiful eyes, blue eyes. And at the end of the day, she came home and she looked up at me and she had big tears. And she said, how could I have been your friend for this long and not have noticed? And I said, because you don't have to. And she just blissfully went along. Like, we've been friends for 20 years. And so she ended up, and then another incident happened where she kind of dropped the ball on some stuff. And I just said, you're going to have to do better. Like, we're friends and you're harming me with some of the stuff that's going on. And so anyhow, she ended up taking an anti-racism course and did all the readings, did all the stuff and whatever. And it really changed how she started dealing with situations and even in her own work and how she sees the world. And she didn't even go through the big sessions that we put on and, that we've designed, but it's just about, when you don't have to see things, we don't have to notice them. But then when you are friends and you care about people, like when Ray talks about that stuff, I know what she's talking about because I've experienced it. Like, we don't have to say that to each other because we just get it. We understand it. I was having a talk about our discrimination harassment policy with somebody saying it's not working. It's not working for racialized students, for Indigenous students. And this person was sort of saying, oh, well, at the end of the day, people just pull out the race card because they feel, because they have nothing else to pull. And I said, how many years have I been here? And they said 10. And I said, do you think that during my 10 years that I've experienced any, discrimination or harassment? He's like, well, yeah. And I said, and how often have I used that policy? And he said, well, you haven't. And I said, exactly. Because it's a last ditch effort. When people are saying that they're being discriminated against, it's because they've taken it on the chin for so long, and it's the last thing that they're going to pull out. And I said, and it's not working. And then instead they're being, they're being punished or re-traumatized or all those things. So I said, we have to do better, and we need to come up with a system that doesn't hurt people and protects people. So anyhow, that's kind of, I can have those conversations now where before I couldn't. I'm just, okay, so Vanessa, would you recommend or to include racism? So, I'm of two minds of that. I really struggle with that because when our president said to everybody the leadership at the university a number of years ago, that everybody's going, like, it was clear your calendars, you're doing this. And so everybody came, and you could tell some people were really struggling. I mean, I have the gift of just sort of calling it out, saying nobody was running to come to anti-racism classes. However, you're here. This is our mandate. This is what we're doing. And we ended up, it changed because there was enough people in the room who were really engaged, really trying, really whatever that. If you're a leader at the university, you better get your game on, because if you're not doing this work, you're not going to be a leader for long, right? So a lot of people really engaged in the conversation. I think when you make it voluntary, that people will opt in or opt out, and you usually get the people that are doing some of this work and have a heart and passion for it. And you're going to get people who don't want to do it, but I don't know. I struggle with that because I think everybody has a responsibility to provide a safe workplace, a safe and inclusive workplace. And I think the leaders have to role model that, and they have to also take it. Like, it's not where you sit up on your throne up there. And, so our president took it. Our current president has taken anti-racism. So I think they role model that. And when there were some issues not long ago, I just texted him and said, hey, there's a problem. And again, he responded because we have that relationship now, because we did the work. So I think if they're leaders, for sure, I think everybody should do it. And for other people, depending upon where they're working, how they're interfacing, what they're doing, then I think you can sort of cherry pick people who are influencers, who they might not be in a formal role, but they're an influencer, that you could ask them to be part of it to help shape and influence the workplace. Vanessa, does that answer?
Right. Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
And I struggle with that too. I think that this should be, but like, everybody should want to do it, right? To understand others. Like, that should be an internal decision. You shouldn't have to be mandated to do that, right? But that's
but
yeah.
even like saying anti-racism, people go, I'm not racist, and yet we've all inherited it. We're all, there's a lot of racism, and most people have it. They just don't want to acknowledge it. And it's because it's inherited and it's so neutral, right? It's the neutrality that it protects the existing systems, and anti-racism challenges them.
Sometimes they just don't even realize that what they're doing is racist at that point, because that's what they grew up with their entire life. They're like, that's it. Like, this is how I was.
Ray has her hand up.
Yeah. And I give a lot of grace to people, because that's the thing, is people grew up, like they grew up this way and they didn't know any other way, right? But then when you start challenging and you start unpacking stuff, I had one of my colleagues come up to me and said, Liz, I'm a racist. I was like, hallelujah. And she's like, I realized, and like she just had all these epiphanies, and it was beautiful. Like it was really great.
I wish we could get everybody like a VR life in the day of other people, just so they can have that experience and be like, oh, your life is much different than other people's lives, even if you don't think it is.
Yeah, well, and it's time, it's effort, and it's energy. But if you really want to have an inclusive place, you have to have, because I get tired of speaking up all the time. My colleagues speak up for me now, right? Like if they hear something, and some of the people I've trained and who I mentor right now, they're like, oh, I just did a microaggression. That's a whole other topic of whatever, right? Like liberal racism, meritocracy, liberal racism. Like there's so many topics to cover that impact how we do our work. So, Ray.
Yeah. Hey, no, I'm enjoying the conversation. It's a good one for sure. I just wanted to talk a little about the recommending organizations to include training. And I think it's a little bit like it was like touched on, but it's tough to get that type of training, or that type of like awareness training or cultural sensitivity to people that actually need it in the organization. It's almost impossible, which is unfortunate. When I was in the Coast Guard on the EDI committee, like the campaign that we launched was across the board for the region, which was like the whole of Western Canada. And it was targeting primarily the fleet operations, because those are the people that go on the boats, and they go on cruise and everything. And there was like very, very extreme racism, very extreme discrimination, leading to physical violence, sexual violence on these ships. And it wasn't really being addressed. It was just getting lost, like people would go to HR and they'd be like, oh, well, that's too bad. Our policy doesn't allow for that. So our new lead guy, like he basically said, like there's zero tolerance for it. And the EDI policies that we created helped to like set a standard, but the standard is only as effective as much as the leadership wants to take it on, because I mean, you can talk until you're blue in the face at a certain level, but I mean, if you don't have like the support of leadership and the support of the people who understand how to implement things and make the words stick like all the way down, it's really hard. It's really hard to get there. So, I mean, I was with the Coast Guard for 4 years, and I saw it, and I saw like myself like as part of like these well-intentioned people. But I mean, in my day-to-day practice, like I would have to go out and call out people who were being racist. I didn't even realize that they were being racist, because they were inquiring about like someone's cultural background or something, but it was like how they did it, and so there's so many different aspects to like that dynamic, that like, and then it also depends on like people's sensitivity to it, and like, should I say something, I mean, there's so many things. So, I mean, just starting these conversations is important, because it makes awareness, like Liz and her friend, I mean, I also, in my friend group has a lot of Caucasian, like Germanic people in it. And only recently, I've known these people for like 30 years, and only recently they've started asking, oh, like, what First Nation are you from? Like, oh, I said that, and I've been saying this for years. I didn't realize that was racist. I mean, it's just, it's the awareness, I think. So Yeah, but it's a tough one. The organizations in training.
So I'm going to get you for homework, Ray. I'm going to get you to look up. I'm going to get you to look up why we don't use Caucasian and we just say white.
Oh, okay, sure.
So because people, when they hear white, they're like, well, I'm not like, they're like, oh, that's offensive. And it's like, well, no, you're white, right? And I'm brown. It's okay. Like it's because nobody wants to be called out or nobody wants to acknowledge whiteness as a construct, right? But yet we're racialized all the time.
Yeah.
I recently learned, like if I'm in Venezuela, I'm considered white. But
Yes.
Here in Canada, I'm not. My
And that's
husband
shifting too, right? And it always shifts.
And my husband is brown, right? But in Venezuela, he will be considered black. And in here, he's brown. And that's very different. It's very different.
Yeah, and it's shifting.
I've never noticed until very recent, for example, that my husband, when he's with me in a store, he's not chased around. When he's not with me, he is chased by the person in the store. So even us being Latin, both, we also experience different things in different environments.
Yeah.
Right? So I think BHP, for example, does a great job at this anti-racism trainings, and then they keep the topic ongoing. But there are so many variabilities, or it's like a spectrum of different situations and things included in racism that I don't think at training it's enough, right?
No, and I think, and I want to be really clear that there's real distinctions between EDI is very white-centered, and it's about compliance. It's about, kind of doing, and there's some equity about changing some systems. Intercultural, kind of like what you're talking about, is about how do we bridge differences across cultures? How do we understand one another better? How do we build relationships across cultures? But it doesn't change systems and it doesn't change power dynamics, right? Truth and reconciliation is about sovereignty and working together side by side with Indigenous people. So that's a whole separate thing. It's not EDI, it's not interculturalism, it's not, but anti-racism and unconscious bias support all of that work because it's an inside job, like it's a self job about understanding, because we're the ones that do the hiring and the policies and it's like, if you understand yourself and can see yourself in this work and understand how you've been complicit or not, because people say, well, I'm an ally, but don't interrupt racism or sexism or, all the things that go on in the workplace. Anti-racism is about action and changing behaviors, and then looking at systems and structures and calling out power and changing, you're changing that culture in the workplace. So it's very different, but you have to, and people lump them all together, and yet they're very separate and they're very different. Because a lot of people say EDI is indigenization. It is not. It is not even close to that. It is very separate. And so, and yeah, EDI. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Where would you start? What would you recommend for reading if you wanted to start learning deeper about that?
Well, oh my gosh. Okay, so I just happened to have one of my little books on hand. So I do a book study at work with me, and it's called Me and White Supremacy. And it's by Layla Saad, S-A-A-D, Me and White Supremacy. And so I do this book study with people before they do the bigger anti-racism work, because then we cover liberal racism, meritocracy, microaggressions, the history sort of racism. Like we do a lot of different things, racial detours. But this book kind of gets people reflecting. Now, it's written in an American context, but when you're reading it, because it's very heavily focused on Black, when you're reading it, just substitute Canadian, like think with a Canadian lens, like Indigenous and women of color, like from an Indigenous thing. But I do book studies because doing the anti-racism, sessions are quite heavy and long. Like, so I needed to do sort of kind of divide up my work. And so now I do book studies also just to prepare people to do some of the heavier lifting. And you need to have somebody who's grounded in that work to help you do your book study, because then you can call out some of the challenges. And like if you're just doing it on your own, great. And there's a workbook that can go with it. There's a whole bunch of things, that you can do. But it's also about kind of listening to speakers and some of those, like the other person I listen to is Tim Weiss, White Fragility, or sorry, Tim Weiss and Robin DiAngelo, if anybody's familiar with those two. She has some great videos. Yeah, so things like that, reading and videos, I do a lot of that just to keep myself informed, and keep moving forward. So when you do anti-racism, anti-oppression work, it will lift all those other areas, because people see themselves and they understand the power they hold, they understand their biases, they understand how they've been shaped and influenced, and then they start realizing all of this other work matters. But when you just start and you don't do the right work right away, like getting to unconscious bias, I use a tool called the Diversity Awareness Profile. So I have a number of things in my arsenal to get people moving and changing and shifting. And so I guess that's why I get to hang out at the university for as long as I have. So I'm conscious of time. I know we just have a couple of minutes, Vanessa.
Yeah, I wanted to say that. And I also wanted to thank you, Elizabeth. Personally, I wish we had more time to talk, because I think you're very interesting to speak with and very enlightening. So I really appreciated the conversation. Any remarks, Elizabeth, before we close?
No, I just think, it's a journey, and it really is an inside job. Like it really is. Like we have to unpack our own power and privilege, and our own ways of thinking, and just think about, like I ask people sometimes, like, what have you learned about the 60 scoop, or, residential schools or treaties or anything? And they're like, well, we didn't learn any of that. That's a good place to start, like really understanding our history and what it's brought us to. And then how do we want to move forward? But relationships, because people are scared and they don't cross the lines to make friends with Indigenous, Black, and people of color sometimes, because for some reason it's taboo or whatever. So, but yeah, but most of my friends are white, and I do like brown. I do. Some of my best friends are white. Have you heard that before? Some of my best friends, I make a joke out of it because people say, well, some of my best friends are Indigenous. And I'm like, well, some of my best friends are white. I like them.
Okay, I understand now. Yeah.
But that's what I would say. So thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ray,
time.
Tonya, and
Thank you, everybody, for joining. This was wonderful. Thank you, Liz.
okay. Thank you so much.
It was so good.
Thanks, Leah.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the chat.
Yeah, you bet. Take care. Thank you.